There's a massive shift in corporate transparency happening right now in the United States. But here's the twist. It's not coming from Washington, D.C. It's coming from California. And it's about to completely change how thousands of the world's biggest companies have to talk about climate change. Okay, let's get into it.
And we're not talking about a handful of companies here. We're talking about roughly 5,400 of them. And that includes both public and private companies. These are major corporations that are now on the hook to comply with what are, by far, America's toughest climate disclosure laws ever. The scale is just enormous. And the ripple effects? Well, they're going to be felt all across the country.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the big picture of California's new mandate. Then, we'll get into the 2 key laws that make it tick. After that, we'll unpack the legal drama that's unfolding, what companies need to do right now, and finally, what the future looks like. So let's start with this big shift, because even though these are state laws, their impact goes way, way beyond California's borders. They're setting a powerful new precedent for the entire country. And this all happened pretty fast. It was just back in October 2023 that Governor Newsom signed this whole package into law. Then in 2024, a cleanup bill came along to sort of iron out the details. And now all eyes are on 2026. That's the first major deadline when companies actually have to start reporting their data.
Right, and this is the crucial point. California's economy is so massive, it's on track to become the world's 4th largest, that when it makes a rule, major companies all across the U.S. pretty much have to follow it. So this isn't just another state regulation. It's effectively creating a national standard, where frankly, one didn't really exist before.
Okay, so let's get to the real heart of the story. This whole mandate is built on 2 separate but related laws, and understanding the difference between them is absolutely key. Think of it as the data versus the story behind the data.
A really great way to think about this is with an analogy. SB 253, that's like the nutrition label on your food. It gives you the cold, hard facts, the numbers, the quantitative data on a company's greenhouse gas emissions. But SB 261, that's more like the chef's notes. It requires the story, the narrative that explains a company's financial risks from climate change and what they're planning to do about it.
And this chart really breaks down the differences. You can see SB 253, the nutrition label, it targets bigger companies with over $1 billion in revenue, and it has a much bigger potential penalty. SB 261 has a lower revenue bar and a smaller penalty. They also use different reporting frameworks. But, and this is the most important part right now, look at the bottom row. SB 253 is active and enforceable, while SB 261 has been paused by a federal court.
And that brings us to the legal crossroads. Because of a major lawsuit, we've got this split reality for these 2 laws. One is barreling ahead, and the other is stuck in legal limbo.
So here's how the legal battle went down. In early 2024, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce sued to block both laws. At first, a district court said, nope, the laws can proceed. But then things got interesting. In November 2025, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals hit the pause button, but only on SB 261. The risk reporting law. The emissions law was allowed to keep going. And that brings us to where we are now.
So this is the central question, right? What gives? Why did the court make this split decision? You've got 2 laws that seem pretty similar. So why is one moving full steam ahead while the other is stopped in its tracks?
Well, the answer comes down to a First Amendment argument about something called compelled speech. Essentially, the court seems to view the emissions data from SB 253 as purely factual and uncontroversial. It's just numbers. But the narrative reports required by SB 261, where companies have to explain their climate risks and strategies, well, the court saw that as potentially forcing companies to take a political position on a controversial topic.
So the practical result for all those companies is this split reality. They absolutely have to get ready for SB 253's emissions reporting. But for SB 261, the risk reports, those are on hold. For now, complying with that law is basically voluntary until the courts make a final decision. Okay, so that brings us to the most immediate thing for businesses. With SB 253 moving forward, the clock is officially ticking on that first big deadline.
Go ahead and mark your calendars. August 10th, 2026. This is the date the first reports are due. This is the moment this law goes from being a theory on paper to a real-world practice.
So what exactly is due then? For this first deadline, companies need to report their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. That's basically the emissions from their own direct operations and from the energy they buy. And that report will cover their 2025 fiscal year. But, and this is important, the regulators have signaled they're going to be a little lenient at first.
It's something they're calling the good faith safe harbor. What it means is that for this first reporting cycle in 2026, the regulators won't fine companies for incomplete reports as long as they can prove they made a real, genuine effort. It's basically an acknowledgement that this is a huge task, and it gives companies some breathing room to get their act together.
Now, let's look a little further down the road, because this first deadline is really just the warm-up act. The biggest challenges are still to come, like reporting on Scope 3 emissions and getting all this data verified. We're talking about a whole new reality for corporate reporting.
The biggest hurdle, by far, is Scope 3 emissions, which are set to be reported starting in 2027. These are all the indirect emissions from a company's suppliers, their logistics, even from customers using their products. And as you can see, Scope 3 often makes up the vast majority of a company's carbon footprint, sometimes 70 to 90%. Trying to track all that is incredibly complex.
And because it's so tricky, even the regulators are still trying to figure out the best way to roll this out. They're looking at a few options. They could make everyone report everything at once, or maybe they'll phase it in by industry, or maybe they'll just start with the most common categories like business travel. Whatever they decide is going to have huge implications.
And the other game changer here is something called third-party assurance. Starting in 2027, companies will need to have an independent auditor actually verify their emissions data. And that requirement is going to get stricter over time, eventually reaching the same level of scrutiny as a financial audit. Think about that. Climate data is about to be put on the same level as financial data. That is a monumental shift.
So, we end up right back where we started. With one law charging ahead and the other tied up in court, California is forcing a national conversation about corporate transparency. It's rewriting the rules. And the biggest question of all remains: is this the moment a state law becomes the unofficial, de facto national rulebook for climate disclosure in America? Well, I guess we're about to find out.